West Africa was the threshold for African music and arts. Before the slave trade, Africans used music as a tradition to honor members of a tribal king's household. The griot, or master musician, served as a storyteller, tribal historian, and entertainer. A griot was seen as being a great performer, and this cultural implication was passed on for generations. When the slave trade began in the 16th century, the practice of the griot was stopped. Many slave masters did not allow the slaves to continue practicing their cultural traditions in fear of a rebellion or riot. If the slaves had no way to communicate with one another, they could not be a force against the slave owners. As a result, slave owners stripped away the slaves' language, culture, heritage, and everyday traditions. Instead of religious practices that the slaves practiced, such as akuba, voodoo, candomblé, and macumba, they were now forced to convert to Christianity. Instead, they were encouraged to perform church music, work songs, and European popular music to entertain slave owners. Although Christianity was not a choice at first for Africans, many embraced the religion and found solace. In doing so, they also transformed existing worship styles to create spirituals, gospel, and the blues. Spirituals began in the 18th century when African Americans were forced to convert to Christianity. Spirituals offered biblical stories as metaphors for liberation, offered hope for a better life, and helped preserve African cultural memory. For over 2 centuries, the hymns of English composer Isaac Watts were particularly popular among African Americans, and these hymns served as an improvisational basis for the development of spirituals. Hymns were very crucial to the slaves because it allowed them to understand and repeat the lyrics while having the inability to read them. While singing hymns, Africans used the call and response method in order for the congregation to sing along. One person would stand in front of the church and say a line in a song, and the congregation would repeat that line. The songs that developed were called camp meeting hymns or spiritual songs, and the first collection of this music, Slave Songs in the United States, was published in 1867. As slavery came to a close, gospel became the driving force behind the African American entertainment and cultural focus. As gospel continued to flourish throughout the 19th century, whites and blacks began to be receptive to it. Far away from what Christians considered devil music, it became the leading force behind music in the 19th century, making it very popular among churches. As a result, more gospel artists were cultivated, one being Thomas A. Dorsey. Deemed the father of gospel music, Dorsey was a pianist and blues composer in Chicago. He began to write lyrics for gospel during the Great Depression, organizing the first female vocal gospel quartet in history, established the world's first gospel chorus in Atlanta and Chicago, set up a national gospel choral organization, and formed his own gospel music publishing house. With this, he composed close to 1,000 gospel songs, paving the way for other artists. Rosetta Tharpe, Mahalia Jackson, Clara Ward, Alex Bradford, Shirley Caesar, and James Cleveland are just a few artists that continue to help establish gospel throughout America. Contemporary artists such as Kirk Franklin, Mary, Molly Music, Yolanda Adams, Donnie McClurkin, and William McDowell still send the message of the gospel to the masses. Gospel has even developed itself into a new category titled gospel rap, where artists such as Lecrae, Trip Lee, Jay Sun, Level 316, gemstones, and the truth, deliver the same message of the gospel in the form of hip hop.
Before hip-hop and other gospel-inspired genres would become popular, in the streets of Chicago and New Orleans, swing and the blues were combining to create a new piece of music that would come to define the 1920s as the Jazz Age. On January 16, 1919, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, also known as the Prohibition Act. In retaliation to the new ban on alcohol, new clubs known as speakeasies were opened in order to serve smuggled alcohol. It was in these clubs that the first performers experimenting with the new sound found their stage. Jazz became a hit in these new clubs for its unique and wild sound. Its roots in swing and blues gave it the lyrics and beat that it needed. But what made it so charismatic was its unpredictability. Jazz, like its predecessors, also had its roots in the call and response pattern that was founded in slave music. But where it differs is that although the musicians are still responding to a call, their response is now sporadic or improvised. This improvisation gives life to the music and makes each listening experience different from the one before it, even when the same song is played. Well-known musicians who found fame within this time and years to come through this genre are Sidney Bechet, Joe King Oliver, Fletcher Henderson, and James Johnson. Jazz was originally played by African American musicians, but as it started to grow in demand from white patrons, white musicians such as Bing Crosby and Paul Whitman found their own place in jazz history. Female singers such as Ella Fitzgerald and Lena Horne began to add their own flair into jazz through the use of scat. Even with its growing popularity, jazz continued to be viewed as devil music by the white majority population. Its roots in the speakeasy clubs attributed to this belief, but primarily the reason lied in the fact that it was Negro music and inspired shameful dancing. At this time, clubs, even with African American performers, continued to be segregated. This prejudice was strongly upheld by not only the long-standing Jim Crow laws, but by the rise and acceptance of the KKK Klan that gained popularity around the start of the Great Depression. Two musicians that helped to frame jazz and threw it African Americans in a positive light were Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman. Louis Armstrong's exceptional talents made him a hit even amongst white crowds. The demand for his performances were so strong that many clubs broke their white-only rules in order to have him perform. He led the way for many other African American performers to have the opportunity to play at respected and influential clubs. Benny Goodman took a stand for music the day where he went against his manager's wishes and hired Teddy Wilson, Gene Krupa, and later Lionel Hampton and Jackie Robinson to play with him. At this time, not only was it looked down upon for a mixed-race group to play together, it was illegal to have them perform. Many times, Goodman was asked to perform solo, but if he could not play with his whole group, he denied the offer. Through their influence, jazz became popular worldwide. In later years, jazz would come to transform into its many counterparts, such as cool, free, and smooth jazz. It was during the Civil Rights Movement that it made a reoccurrence as soul jazz, and became a symbol of the desegregated United States, with whites and blacks openly playing together. In the years to come, it went through new incarnations through the discovery of rock, pop, hip-hop, and other genres. To this day, many current popular artists describe jazz and jazz artists as an influence in their music. Some of them being Beyoncé and Josephine Baker, Janet Jackson and Diana Ross, Christina Aguilera and Etta James, Celine Dion and Aretha Franklin, and Mariah Carey and Billie Holiday. Most music today holds its roots in African American song and dance. History has changed, transformed, and readjusted the essence of the beats and the stories told, but nonetheless, most musical genres in one way or another attribute their beginnings in the history of African Americans. Through the slave trade, Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, and Civil Rights Movement, music in the United States continues to follow them in order to tell their story, and through it the story of the U.S. itself. Without the bass that African music played in our musical history, it would be shocking to see where our world would be without their musical influence. If anything, it can only be assumed that without it, the music we know of today may never have existed.
Ladies and gentlemen, here's one you all can sing with us. When the Saints go marching in.